Each week at this time, we have a community moment. A member of the Oasis community gets up and shares a thought for the day. It's kind of a brief, 10-minute type deal. And it can be on really all kinds of topics, something you're passionate about, maybe some ideas from a book you read, a movie you saw. We've had everything from learning Esperanto to origami. And so we've had a lot of great community moments. If you'd like to get on the list, please see me. Email me at mike@houstonoasis.org, and we'd be glad to get you on the schedule. And today is I believe, first-time community moment presenter, second time. But he's here every week, does our videography, gets our stuff up on YouTube, one of the backbone people of this organization. Let's give a warm welcome to Bart Phillips.
Good morning, folks. Let's see if I can get this in the right place so I can see and you can hear me. Here at Houston Oasis, we try each week to celebrate the human experience. So typically our community moments are entertaining or uplifting or fun. Sadly, this community moment is none of those things. 8 weeks ago, on Sunday, February 15th, the day after Valentine's Day, Mike did the main talk titled, "All You Need Is Empathy." To me, this is a hugely important topic, one that I think the free thought community sometimes gives short shrift. Mike's talk was thoughtful, well-conceived, and as always, well-delivered. I listened like I always do, sitting back behind that camera, trying to anticipate where he's going with each idea, with each point, following each story, widening the shot to get a crowd reaction when hopefully the funny story gets a crowd reaction, zooming in tighter when it gets more serious or more personal. That evening, I went home, did what I've done almost every Sunday for the last year and a half. Download the video files to my computer, begin the process of turning some raw footage into the videos that go up on our YouTube channel. Figuring out where to cut, adding some captions and crossfades, editing out the announcements and the occasional technical difficulties. Yeah, if you have one of those difficulties where you spend 5 minutes getting the computer to work, I show you bend down and then I show you stand back up and it's working. And sometimes I tweak the audio to get it just right. Sometime that evening while I was working on Oasis videos, my next door neighbor of 15 years, my dentist for about the past 5 years, my friend Willie went into his backyard not 150 feet from where I sat working, and he killed himself. I went to bed that night not knowing what had happened. Even though police and emergency personnel poured into our little cul-de-sac about 10:30, sirens blaring, I somehow, uncharacteristically, slept right through it all while the family next door saw their lives turned into a nightmare. A few things about Willie. He's 9 years older than me. I always kind of looked up to him. His 3 sons are about the same age as my 2 daughters. His kids and my kids rode bikes up and down the cul-de-sac together, waited for the school bus at the same corner. I sometimes watch with a bit of envy as he and his wife and his boys loaded up in their SUV and headed out for a weekend at the lake, or when I could hear them all laughing and splashing in their pool just over the fence. Willie was one of the nicest guys I've ever known. He always seemed so upbeat, always had a smile, friendly words when we passed while checking the mail or taking out the trash. He served honorably in the Navy for many years. He has a son who's on a submarine right now. He had taken in another young man who was having some serious family problems. He and his wife had opened a dental practice many years ago, dedicated to providing low-cost dental care, especially to needy children. I didn't go to see him at first, kind of an aside here, because I felt kind of guilty about him doing the low cost. He called me one day and said, "You need to come see me. I'll take good care of you." His wife was a dental hygienist, and many times while Willie drilled out one of my cavities or his wife scraped away at my plaque, he always asked about how my girls were doing and told stories about his sons. Now, I can hardly imagine the grief and anger and sorrow that his wife and boys went through and are still going through even now. And even as a person who's battled his own share of loneliness and depression, I find it hard to imagine that a man with so much yet to live for would take his own life, especially knowing the awful, awful pain that it would inflict on his loved ones. With all that my neighbors are going through, it feels terribly selfish for me to stand up here talking about my own sorrows. But Willie's suicide hit me remarkably hard. We didn't really learn the full story until Tuesday, 2 days later. And I was horror-struck to learn that he had hanged himself, knowing that it would be his wife or one of his sons who would find him. That same Tuesday night, when we learned the details, there was an Oasis committee meeting of some sort. April and I first decided we weren't going to go, and then we went ahead and went. Although April's always been my solid rock, person I've been able to talk to for 32 years. I know we've only been married 31. I was kind of hoping that evening to have a chance to talk with some compassionate Oasians about some of the thoughts and emotions that were boiling away in my mind. We arrived at the meeting a little early, and I mentioned to the 2 or 3 that were there already that my neighbor of 15 years had taken his own life. I remember someone gasped. Somebody said, "Oh, that's awful." I mentioned his family was Catholic. Somebody said something not so kind about Catholics. Not really the words I was hoping to hear. So about that same time, someone else arrived, came in, and we stopped and greeted them, and that was the end of it. We never talked about it again that night. So I did what we Southern boys have been taught to do for generations. I took my churning thoughts, my seething emotions, and I locked them inside this private little lockbox that I've carried around inside of me all of my life. And with a click, that was that. The next night was Wednesday. There was a visitation at the funeral home. There was also an Oasis midweek dinner that night. We don't often go to the midweek dinners. They're usually way around on this side of town. We live up far north. But this one was going to be in North Houston, in the Heights. In fact, just a few blocks over from where my dad grew up. So we decided to go to the funeral home first and then come and join some fellow Oasians for dinner. The visitation at the funeral home was surreal and emotionally wearing. All the way there, I kept thinking, what do you say to a widow whose spouse took his own life? What possible words of comfort can you say to his sons? So we arrived and saw the funeral home was all decorated with classic rock memorabilia. Willie was a big collector. I used to sit in his chair and he'd play some old songs and we'd try and guess who could name it first. He beat me all the time. There were family photos hung up on the walls between Beatles posters and Rolling Stones. It was both very moving and very weird. We hugged the family, offered what words of consolation we could. I left there emotionally drained and raw and feeling pretty dang miserable. We got to the midweek dinner, and a half hour later, I approached the table, 4 or 5 Oasians. Someone asked me how I was doing. I said I was having a really tough evening. That I'd come from a funeral home, that my neighbor of 15 years had taken his own life. I mentioned he'd been my dentist as well. Someone jumped in to point out, oh, dentists have a higher than average suicide rate. Someone else agreed, and that became the topic at the table. I blocked out what was said. I could feel my face begin to burn. When the whole table laughed at something I didn't hear, I just turned around and walked off. Truth is, I was disappointed and hurt. Had I been there alone, I most likely would have walked right out the door. April had already found a table, though, fortunately, with 2 of the kindest people I know. And if not for Alexis and Jesse, I may have dumped Oasis right there on the spot. But I got to talk about things a bit, and I took the rest of my anger and hurt, and I locked it up in that little internal lockbox. Friday morning, 2 days later, was the memorial service at the Houston National Cemetery. There was a funeral mass scheduled around noon. We chose not to go to the mass, but we did go to the memorial service. If you've ever been to a memorial service with full military honors, you know it's both a very moving and very sterile in its formality, with aged veterans firing blanks over the head of the crowd and military chaplains stoically reading hollow words of thanks and comfort off of pre-printed cards. I watched helplessly during the service as Willie's son sat up in the front row, stooped shoulders shuddering with grief and anguish. Afterwards, I said a few feeble words, what I could, and we left, stopping by the grave of my stepdad, who's also buried there at Houston National Cemetery. So when I left the cemetery, I was an emotional wreck. And April and I talked through it on the way home. And the rest of my feelings and thoughts, I did what I have done all my life. I just locked them away. The following day was Saturday, Oasis Potluck Day. And April had volunteered to host one of those potlucks. My daughter Amber was in for the weekend. She's in today as well. And as we all dusted and vacuumed and mopped, my emotions churned, and I really looked forward to spending 5 or 10 minutes that evening talking about my friend Willie and how suicide had impacted me. Unfortunately, that opportunity never really came. I tried to play the good host, ended up at a table with a couple of people who enjoy doing the talking. So while they alternated telling their tales, I sat and tried very unsuccessfully to listen. I was feeling pretty torn up inside. I really just wanted to go outside and scream or cry or both. Sometime during the chatter about movies and politics and careers, I tried to bring up the subject that was eating me up. My friend and neighbor had killed himself, and I was pretty torn up about it. And I was totally unprepared for the reaction I got. What I got back was this wall of sound that came at me, this barrage of talk. Data about suicide and depression and stories of other people's suicides and stages of grief. And I really needed to talk about a few things, and instead everybody was talking at me. So I just shut it all out. I was sitting at my own kitchen table with nearly a half dozen well-meaning Oasians sitting around me, and I felt utterly alone. Well, then it happened. A little lock on that little private lockbox of mine burst. And I said some things. I don't even remember what I said. My friend Bruce Hurst was there, and he said, I don't really have anything to apologize for. That's good. But I said some things I'd never meant to say. It just kind of came out. I don't remember all of it. All I even remember is ending by slapping the table in rhythm to the words, "No one even asked." So here's the deal. For some of us, maybe for many of us, especially for those of us that come from religious backgrounds, have religious families who now feel ostracized and alone in this world, for us, for me at least, Oasis is all that I have. Everyone I call a friend I met through Oasis. Other than my wife and my 2 girls, I have no one else in the world that I can talk to about these kinds of things. No one but you. I needed help. I needed compassion. Up here on the wall, it says that we are a community of compassion and reason. Just what do we mean when we say that? What do we mean we are a community of compassion? The reason I see it all the time in our talks, our presentations, our conversations. But what about compassion? What is compassion? So Merriam-Webster defines compassion as a sympathetic consciousness of others' distress, together with a desire to alleviate it. The word compassion is derived from the Latin word compati. If you come from Catholic Church. In Church Latin, that'd be compatsi, meaning to bear or to suffer along with. To bear or suffer along with someone. By definition, then, compassion requires two things: an awareness of another's distress and a desire to help. Contrast compassion with reason. In a grammatical sense, reason requires a subject. You reason through something, or you reason about something. You know what? You can go in a room all by yourself and reason to your heart's content. But compassion requires an object. You have compassion for someone. You express compassion to someone. And note I said someone. You can even show compassion to a person or a dog. But no matter how much you love your car, I don't think you can call it compassion when you're touching up the paint. Compassion requires a recipient, someone or some creature that can receive and acknowledge the receipt of those expressions of compassion. We've always said we want to be known as a compassionate community. So how do we do that? Honestly, I don't know. Individually, there are things we can do to be compassionate, especially when it comes to listening. Marina, you nailed it. Listening. Just listen. I am by nature and trade one who fixes things and solves problems. So I'm not, as my dear wife would remind me, always good at listening without trying to take over and trying to propose solutions and suggest answers. But what most people need is a caring, patient, sympathetic pair of ears, not an eager advice giver. Most people, especially men, I think, are very hesitant to show weakness or to ask for help. And it doesn't matter if there's some justifiable reason we've evolved this way, or if this is somehow more related to male shame that Dr. Darrell Ray talked of a few weeks ago. We are often this way, bottled up emotionally. But we still have a need to be able to share safely what we feel with someone else who shares in our feelings. We all need empathy. April and I have always wanted our role in the community to be about providing stability, to be examples of how a free thought family can be part of this type of thing together. I've always seen myself more as one who wipes away the tears than one who sheds them. But somehow I think songwriter Bill Withers got it right back in 1972, and you all know the words. Sometimes in our lives, we all have pain. We all have sorrow. But if we are wise, we know that there's always tomorrow. You just call on me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on. I just might have a problem that you'll understand. We all need somebody to lean on. We say we are a community that celebrates the human experience, and that is a wonderful thing to do. But where do free thinkers go to talk about, to share, to prepare for those aspects of the human experience that are not so celebratory? As humanists, we must accept that human life, while wonderful and joyous at times, is often also filled with depression and loneliness and grief and despair and sickness and death and divorce and job loss and a whole lot of other things that are not entertaining to hear nor much fun to discuss. But what do we as an organization do to live up to our claim that we are a compassionate community? Well, while I have a few ideas myself, that's the question I will leave with you. To close, I want to say that aside from my wife and my two girls, I don't really have anything but Houston Oasis. I love this organization, its goals and ideals. I love the people I get to interact with each week. But I'm quite certain that I'm not the only one to come through those doors in need of compassion. I'm quite certain I'm not the only one here today that has some private pain, some secret sorrow they could use help with. I believe the need for a compassionate secular community is greater than we imagine. I believe we can be that kind of community, the kind that people turn to when their lives come unraveled, when pain and sorrow come calling. To be that kind of community, we must want to be that kind of community. I believe we can do even better, and I believe that we will. Thank you.